It started with reports, subtle signs that something wasn't right in one household. Warnings that should have led to action, yet they didn't, and as a result, a heartbreaking situation unfolded. Not all warnings are obvious. Sometimes they come as small signs. Sometimes they show up in quiet concerns, whispers, reports, small signs that something isn't right. But what happens when those warnings are ignored? For one child, those warnings were more than enough. But they weren't enough to save him. This is the story of Adam Mann. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel, they help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now, let's get into it. Michelle Mann's story didn't begin in a stable home. It didn't start with warm memories of childhood or the comfort of a secure family. From a young age, her life was shaped by instability, passed through the system, learning early that protection was something not easily found. She had grown up in foster care, shuffled between placements, never truly belonging anywhere. Her mother, who had her own troubled past, was often in and out of prison. It was a cycle that seemed impossible to break. And then, one night, everything changed. During a confrontation, Michelle's mother got into an altercation. The details of that night were grim, but the outcome was clear. She lost her life. Witnesses said she was caught in a fight, and in a tragic moment, she fell from a great height. Her death was sudden. And Michelle, who was already navigating an unstable childhood, was now completely alone. With nowhere else to go, Michelle remained in the system until she was old enough to leave. But when she did, she wasn't stepping into a better life, she was simply continuing the cycle. She had children of her own, and soon, her family became one of the many cases under the watch of child welfare services. It wasn't long before the first report came in. By 1983, social workers were already familiar with the Mann household. There were concerns, serious ones. Reports described troubling conditions, but it was one particular case that stood out. One of Michelle's children, an older sibling of Adam, had been brought to the hospital with concerning injuries. Medical staff documented multiple fractures, serious enough to raise questions. But despite the reports, the child remained in the home. A timeline of hospital visits painted a picture that should have been impossible to ignore. Over a span of 14 months, the same child had suffered repeated injuries. Each time, there was an explanation. He had fallen, he had bumped into something, it was an accident. But doctors knew better. Child welfare was contacted, investigators visited the home, they documented what they saw, checked the children, and asked their questions. Reports were filed. But nothing changed. Despite multiple red flags, no immediate action was taken. The children remained in the home. At one point, concerns were raised that one of the children had been left alone in a small space as a form of discipline. In another instance, a child was seen with unexplained marks on his face. Still, no intervention. And then came another hospital visit, another injury, another report. But the caseworker handling the file didn't escalate it further. Instead, it was categorized under concerns, not an emergency, not a situation that required immediate removal. It was a decision that, in hindsight, would prove devastating. So by the time Adam Mann was born in 1985, the situation had already spiraled. His family had already been flagged. The home had already been investigated. The system had already been given a chance to act. But those warnings weren't enough. And soon, Adam wouldn't just be part of the story, he would become the story. Adam Mann entered the world under a shadow of concern. From the moment he was born on February 20th, 1985, hospital staff knew they had to be cautious. His mother, Michelle Mann, already had a history with child welfare services. Reports had been filed, warnings had been issued, there was already a record. So Adam wasn't sent home right away. Instead, he remained in the hospital nursery under protective custody. Authorities made the decision to keep him there for his safety. It was a precaution, a way to ensure that history wouldn't repeat itself. But precautions only last for so long. Michelle wanted her son back. To regain custody, Michelle had to prove she was capable of caring for Adam. There were conditions, steps she needed to follow. She agreed to enter a parenting program at the New York Foundling Center, a facility designed to help parents with histories of neglect, or CA. It was a monitored environment, supervised, controlled. For the next several months, Michelle lived there with Adam and one of his siblings, attending mandatory classes, following strict guidelines. On paper, it looked like progress. Reports suggested improvement. There were no immediate signs of harm. Staff at the Foundling Center noted that Michelle was meeting the program's requirements. So after a year, they made a decision. She was discharged from the program. Adam was no longer under protective custody. He was going home. At first, things seemed stable. The family was being monitored, caseworkers made their visits, reports were filed, and on paper, everything looked fine. But monitoring isn't the same as intervention. Behind closed doors, away from check-ins and scheduled visits, reality started to shift. Michelle's struggles didn't disappear. Parenting classes didn't erase a lifetime of instability, and with no immediate consequences, old patterns had room to return. Adam was just a baby. He wouldn't remember the time he spent in protective custody. He wouldn't remember the safety of the hospital nursery. He only knew the home he was growing up in, and once the watchful eyes turned away, he had no way of knowing that his protection had already been lost. When Michelle Mann left the New York Foundling Center, she didn't return to a new beginning. She didn't find a fresh start. Instead, she went back to what was familiar, the same environment that had raised concerns before. She moved back in with her father at Edenwald Houses, Bronx, the same place where reports had been filed, where warnings had already been given. It didn't take long before Rufus Chisholm moved in too. With both parents back under the same roof, tension in the home increased. Family members recalled arguments behind closed doors, moments of conflict that seemed to come out of nowhere. But there was no outside intervention. There were no follow-ups on the family's living situation. From the outside, they were just another household trying to make ends meet. Inside, things were shifting. Caseworkers had been inside that home before. They had seen the living conditions. But each time, there was a conclusion that echoed over and over again. No immediate danger. There was no reason to remove the children, they said. But there were reasons. Many of them. Another caseworker filed a report expressing concerns about the home. It was noted that discipline in the household seemed excessive. The children were often kept in strict routines. But without direct proof of harm, the case remained open. On paper, at least. In reality, it wasn't being actively monitored. At first, it seemed like Adam was just being treated differently. He was given more rules, more expectations. He was punished more frequently than his siblings. Then, he started getting less food. The difference was small at first, smaller portions, stricter meal times. But soon, there were nights when he wasn't given dinner at all. At a young age, Adam often didn't get enough to eat. He tried to sneak food, a piece of bread, a cup of juice, but when he was caught, the punishments became harsher. If he took food without permission, he would get in trouble. If he made mistakes, the consequences were often strict. At some point, Adam stopped trying. His siblings, still close to him, began to notice. He didn't play as much. He didn't talk as much. He became quieter over time, as if trying not to draw attention to himself. But that didn't mean he was okay. For 2 years, the case remained in the system, not closed, but not actively checked either. A caseworker was reassigned. Another home visit was scheduled. But by then, the patterns had already been set. By then, Adam had already learned that speaking up wouldn't change anything, and in those 2 years, things would only get worse. By the time Adam was nearing his 5th birthday, the atmosphere in the home had shifted. His siblings still played together, still found small moments of happiness in their routines, but Adam was different. The change wasn't sudden, it was gradual, almost unnoticed at first, but little by little, he was being set apart. He spent more time alone, distance from the others. He was given stricter rules, more severe consequences, and while his siblings were allowed to eat, Adam often wasn't. He began losing weight. Family members later recalled seeing him standing in the corner for long periods of time, hands up, eyes lowered, as if waiting for permission to move. The punishments became more frequent, more isolating. But when a child is quiet, when they stop resisting, stop crying, stop trying, the signs can be easy to overlook. He was always hungry, that much was clear. His brothers started noticing that, while they were given meals, Adam wasn't always included. If he wanted food, he had to take it. So, he did. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he would sneak to get whatever he could get, and each time he was caught, the punishments grew worse. Eventually it became clear he was being deprived, and the more he tried to fix it himself, the more severe the consequences became. Over time, Adam lost weight and neighbors noticed he looked different, but the family brushed off concerns. He's just small, they were told. He's a picky eater. But it wasn't that simple. His brothers saw what was happening. They saw how he was punished, how his cries for help went unanswered, and worst of all, they saw how no one stepped in to stop it. Until a night that started like any other. It was March 5, 1990. The family had gone to sleep, or at least most of them had. Sometime during the early hours, something woke a neighbor with a knock at the door. When the knock came at the door, it wasn't the kind of knock that could be ignored. It wasn't casual, and it wasn't expected. The person standing outside wasn't someone who usually knocked this late, and there was no small talk, no hesitation. Just a message, short and urgent. Something's wrong with Adam. For a moment there was uncertainty. The neighbor hesitated, because there had always been quiet concerns however he followed. And inside, on the floor, was Adam. Still. Silent. His small frame unmoving. It was clear he needed help right away, so they rushed him for medical care. Everything after that happened fast. A rush to get him outside. A hurried trip to Our Lady of Mercy Hospital. The hospital staff had seen emergencies before, had handled tragedies, had worked under pressure when every second counted. But when Adam was placed in front of them, something changed. There was a stillness in the room, a quiet realization among the most experienced doctors that this was different. It wasn't just that he was unresponsive, it was everything else. The signs, the evidence that this wasn't an isolated moment, but something that had been happening for a long time. Doctors quickly realized his health concerns had been ongoing for a long time. There were things no child should have endured, patterns that couldn't be ignored, injuries that raised more questions than answers. As the medical team worked, trying to do what they could, the reality became clear. There was nothing more they could do. Despite the doctor's efforts, Adam did not make it. The news spread quickly, and with it came a flood of questions that should have been asked long before. A 5-year-old boy was gone, and for the first time people wanted to know why. The hospital staff had seen the signs, the authorities had been called, and the system that had been involved for years was now forced to answer for what had happened. Reports were reviewed, decisions were scrutinized, and the reality that emerged was difficult to ignore. For so long, there had been warnings, yet they had never led to meaningful change. Now, people started asking how this was allowed to go on for so long, and why no one stepped in sooner. But now, it was too late. The damage had already been done, and all that remained was the question of accountability. Authorities arrived at the apartment, the same place where reports had been made before, but this time, they weren't just there to assess the situation or document concerns. This time, they were looking for answers. Neighbors were questioned, case files were pulled, and slowly, a timeline began to take shape. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that this hadn't happened overnight. There had been signs, consistent, documented, and impossible to ignore. There had been reports filed by medical professionals, social workers, and even those who lived nearby. There had been multiple opportunities for intervention, but each time, the system had failed to act. Now the responsibility fell to the legal system, and the question remained, would the outcome be any different this time? Michelle Mann and Rufus Chisholm were both arrested, and the case moved to court. However, despite the years of documented concerns, the legal proceedings never made it to trial. Instead, plea deals were offered, and the consequences that followed were far from what many expected. Michelle Mann pleaded guilty to 2 counts of assault related to prior incidents involving her children. Instead of a lengthy sentence, she was given just 3 years in prison. She served her full term and was released in 1994. Rufus Chisholm, the one responsible for the final incident, received a sentence of 7 to 14 years. He became eligible for parole after 7 years and was released in 1997. Many people were surprised by how short the sentences were, especially given the repeated concerns over the years. Since the case never went to trial and no deeper investigation was pursued, the process moved quickly. The same system that was supposed to protect Adam was now in charge of deciding justice, leaving many wondering if enough had been done. Chisholm later spoke about what had happened, acknowledging his actions but also attempting to reshape the narrative. "I'm not that person anymore," he said during an interview in 1996. "But no matter what I say, I know people are going to think I'm a monster." He went on to express regret but also seemed to downplay the severity of what had taken place, saying, "Some nights I wish he could appear because I wonder if he died thinking, they don't love me. I want to hear him say, 'Daddy, I forgive you.'" For Adam's surviving brothers, the pain of the past was something they carried long after the legal process had ended. One of them, years later, reflected on what had happened, stating, "We all knew what it felt like to be in Adam's place. We all knew." After the sentencing, an internal review was launched to determine what had gone wrong. A confidential report was written, and while it was never released to the public, it quietly confirmed what many had suspected all along. There had been failures that had been noted but never addressed, decisions that had led to missed opportunities, and reports that had been filed but never resulted in action. The Fatality Review Board examined the case and found that multiple agencies had been involved, but had not done enough to intervene when it mattered most. Despite these findings, no formal action was taken. No caseworkers faced disciplinary measures, no policies were changed, and no one was held accountable for the missteps that had allowed this to happen. The case was officially closed, and, just like that, the system moved on. But for those who had witnessed what happened, moving on wasn't so easy. So, where is everyone now? Michelle Mann and Rufus Chisholm served their sentences and were released, free to continue their lives. The home that had once been filled with children was now empty, and those children, Adam's siblings, were left to navigate the aftermath. As they grew older, each of them had to find their own way to process what had happened. Some distanced themselves from the past, trying to leave behind the memories that haunted them. Others, however, carried the weight of it more openly. Years later, one of Adam's brothers spoke publicly, sharing his memories and recounting what life had been like inside that apartment. He gave a voice to the story that had once been ignored, and, in doing so, ensured that Adam's name would not be forgotten. Adam's story was never just about him. It was about a system that was supposed to work but didn't. It was about the decisions that shaped his life long before he had a say in them. It was about the moments when things could have gone differently but didn't. His story serves as a reminder that when warnings go unheard, these tragedies don't end, they repeat. This story leaves behind a question that is impossible to ignore. What should have been done differently? How do we make sure that cases like this are seen, heard, and addressed before it's too late? These are conversations that matter, discussions that need to continue, because acknowledging these failures is the first step toward making sure they don't happen again. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think could have changed the outcome for Adam? What do you think needs to happen to prevent stories like his from repeating? If you found this video informative and believe that stories like Adam's need to be told, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. It helps ensure that these stories reach more people and that these names are never forgotten. Because Adam Mann's name should never be lost to time. And stories like his should never have to be told again.